We showed how everyone could live within them. We asked how ideas travel and made design a universal language. We asked how to make the future fairer and found new ways to make technology serve humanity. And we asked what to feed cows to fight climate change, or if llamas could help make vaccines, or if beans in toast could improve our health, or if classrooms even need walls. Because progress doesn't happen by waiting to be asked. A 100 years on, our biggest question remains the same. What's next?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our spring lecture in, as you might have noticed, it's our centenary year, and this is the first of our public lectures in our centenary year, so it's a special pleasure to welcome you to that today. It's also fitting, given the topic of the lecture, that it is Earth Day, one of the many days that the UN puts into our calendar to celebrate this and that, but Earth Day is clearly one of the more important ones dedicated to global climate action, environmental education, and sustainability, all themes that our speaker will pick up in different ways throughout the next hour or so. So it's wonderful to see so many of you here today, both in the room, but also on the live stream. My name is Dominic Zaum. I'm one of the Provost Chancellors here at the university, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Deepa Senapathi from our School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. Deepa is an applied ecologist who actually started here for her PhD and stayed, like so many of us, whose work focuses on how climate change and land use changes affect biodiversity and the vital services that nature provides for society, for economy, for the ecosystem around us. And I think if there's one thing that has characterized Deepa's work, it is collaboration. And it is a collaboration with policymakers. She was a policy fellow in Defra for a number of years. She has worked with conservation groups all over Europe and collaborated in particular also with smallholder farmers in South India to develop more sustainable and biodiversity-friendly crop systems. So you're working with those who work on the land, who experience that and live, and who experience biodiversity, or the consequences of a lack of biodiversity every day is very much at the heart of her work. She's also a member of the University of Reading's B team, this most collaborative of animals, so there's a clear theme there, who works around the world to highlight the value of pollinators and find solutions to protect them. And you might have seen some of that work outside. Today's talk will run for about 45 minutes, and so there's plenty of time for questions. There are opportunities for interacting during the talk through the Menti. That should work for both the audience here in the room, but also for those who are online. So without any further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Deepa Senapathi.
Thank you, Dominic. Good evening, everyone. And I am thrilled to see so many of you here. And I'm very grateful that you chose to leave the beautiful weather outside and join me indoors this evening. On Earth Day, as Dominic mentioned, I think it would be really lovely for us to kind of celebrate the wide variety of life that we have on this planet. And I'm hoping that this talk is going to touch upon that, but also sort of where and how our own lives intersect with the beautiful biodiversity in the world around us. So many moons ago, when I was a research student, trying to find ways of communicating my research and findings, not just to other academics, but to a wider audience, I came across Edward Abbey, an author, an essayist, and an environmental activist. And Edward Abbey's quote that I found during my days as a student resonated strongly with me then and continues to resonate with me today. And Mr. Abbey says, any good poet in our age at least must begin with a scientific view of the world. And any scientist worth listening to must be something of a poet, must possess the ability to communicate to the rest of us the sense of love and wonder at what their work discovers. Now, I am no poet, but I do have a love and passion for the natural world. And I hope that in the next hour or so, I will be able to kind of communicate a little bit of that to you. I'm sure all of you here have your own reasons why you love the world around us, but I'm hoping that in sharing some of my experiences, you will go away thinking a little bit more about how our interactions every day and the decisions we make every day impact not just us, our families, and those people around us, but also the biodiversity and the wider natural world. Unfortunately, I have to start with a little bit of not so good news. Now, in the natural world, survival of the fittest is an agreed concept. Species survive when they're able to adapt to changing conditions. However, the rate of extinction that we're currently experiencing is unprecedented. It's on a scale we've never seen before. So over 1 million species are currently threatened with extinction. And this is happening over land, over sea, over fresh water. And the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, puts out these red lists every year. And what you need to see here is across different groups of biodiversity, the bits that are in red, orange, and yellow are the ones of concern. So the reds are critically endangered species, the oranges are endangered species, and the yellows are threatened species. And year on year, this proportion is increasing. What's even more alarming is that 73% of declines in wildlife populations have happened in just the last 50 years. So there's something we're not getting quite right when it comes to biodiversity and the world around us. Now, you might think, sure, there's a lot of biodiversity around there. Some species might be going extinct. That doesn't really impact my day-to-day living. But you may have heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these are 17 goals that were set in place in 2015, and the targets were set to be attained by 2030. Now, quite broadly, the main thing we have there is Goal 17, which is partnership to achieve all the other 16 goals. And you have goals that are to do with the economy and the society, but underpinning our societal and economic goals are things to do with the biosphere. Things like clean air and clean water, which we take as a right, but also life on land and life in water. Anything that impacts the biosphere in a negative way has knock-on consequences for societal and economic impacts. And these are impacts that, these are ambitious targets that talk about no hunger and zero poverty. And if we are not achieving these targets because we're not looking after our biosphere, that's a real problem. Now, a recent sort of assessment of these targets showed that over half of these targets are going to be missed by 2030. But also, a third of these targets are getting worse than their 2015 baseline. So you might ask, why are we having these problems? Why are we losing biodiversity at this unprecedented rate? And the answer is quite complex. There's a multitude of drivers that are causing this. Climate change, where it's affecting where species can live and thrive. We have invasive species coming into play, where species that normally don't occur in an area might come in and outcompete native species for their resources. Habitat loss, you cannot talk about drivers of biodiversity change without talking about habitat loss. The rate at which habitat is being lost and fragmented, again, is at an unprecedented scale. Overexploitation over land and sea, whether we're talking about hunting or overfishing, we're destroying a lot of species out there. And pollution over air, land, and water. Now, All of these, while accepted as the main drivers of biodiversity loss, are not independent of each other. These drivers all interact with each other and quite often exacerbate the effects of each other. And together, they almost cause this perfect storm of biodiversity decline. In addition to that, we also have emerging diseases and pathogens that are decimating populations, communities, and species globally. So let's talk about one or two of these in the first instance. So let's talk about climate change. We're in a beautiful spring evening today. I'm very glad the sun's out. If you're anything like me, I can't wait every year to see the first snowdrop or the first crocus come out. I mean, it's the end of a long winter and it's beautiful to see the flowers blooming. And I've already planned my next bluebell walk this coming weekend. Now, when flowers start blooming is quite a key indicator of our climate. So the warmer springs are causing plants to flower a lot earlier. So there is consensus amongst the wide scientific literature that for every 1 degree rise in temperature, flowering plants are blooming 4 to 5 days earlier. Now, you may have seen, I think it was 2 days ago in the BBC News, they were talking about the bluebells being several weeks earlier this year, and this is the earliest they've been in decades. So we have these plants that are sort of definitely flowering earlier, and there's also changes happening over space. So Fruit Watch, which was a citizen science initiative set up by one of my PhD students, looked at people's gardens and their fruit trees and gardens in parks and public spaces. And Chris, my student, found out that fruit trees in the south are flowering a lot earlier because temperatures in the south are much warmer than in the north. So we have this issue where the changing climate is affecting the timing of flowering over space and time, but it's not just the plants. Now, we found that wild bees in Britain are emerging almost a week earlier for every degree rise in temperature. Now, everything is getting earlier. Shouldn't really be a problem, right? Well, the problem comes when things emerge at different rates. So with the plants emerging 4 to 5 days earlier, the bees emerging a whole week earlier, currently they're still synchronous, but over time there is a possibility that things could diverge. It could be that we get to a point with our changing climate that the pollinators, the bees, emerge a whole lot earlier. They don't have the floral resources that they need to survive, and they don't survive. And when the flowers finally bloom, there aren't enough bees to pollinate them. So it could become a problem in the future. Now, it remains to be seen if our ecosystems can adapt to these changing environments and provide long-term resilience. But this tends to be a sort of watching brief where we talk about phenology, the timing of key life history events across different taxa, across different levels of biodiversity to see if this is a problem. Maybe you think, right, changing climate is an issue, but as you said, it might be an issue for a few years down the line. What about the more immediate threats? So research from our department has shown that traffic, for instance, with diesel vehicles causing air pollutants actually disrupt plant-pollinator interactions. So the floral odors that plants give out, which attract the bees, are changed or modified or altered due to diesel exhaust fumes, which means it also alters the foraging behavior of bees. However, we also found that even in high traffic intensity areas, if road verges had a lot of flowers, if they were filled with floral rich flower margins as opposed to just grassy margins, there were a lot of insects there. There were more butterflies, there were more bees, there were more hoverflies. So you're beginning to see this picture where the way we manage our land and our landscapes has an impact on whether or not it can ameliorate the negative impacts of our day-to-day activities. I can't talk about drivers of biodiversity loss without talking about land use. Now, land use and land management is the single biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And unfortunately, about 3/4 of the Earth's land surface has been altered by human activity in the last millennia. Now, it's not unusual, and I'm sure that in most of our lifetimes, we have seen at least images or videos of huge forests being cleared for timber or beautiful green spaces being completely urbanized. But also in the last couple of decades, there's been much more awareness of our need to protect habitat. So we do have sort of national and international designations. We have wildlife sanctuaries, national nature reserves, marine protected areas, sites of special scientific interest. So there is this push to protect pristine habitat and land that is useful for biodiversity. However, a study in 2020 showed that only 10% of such protected area networks is structurally connected. And what this means is that while there's protected land, it's quite fragmented. And if one area of protected habitat becomes unsuitable, it's very difficult for the species that are there to find another refugia nearby or find a corridor where they can get to another refugia. So having such protected habitat is a good thing, but the interconnectedness, we need to do a lot better. So much of this sort of land use, the blame for the land use and the way we manage our land has been placed on squarely on our agricultural practices. This need for sort of intensive production to ensure that we can feed the ever-growing world population. And a lot of debate goes on what we should eat, how much of what we should eat. Have you had your 5 a day today? Should you go completely vegan? Should you go vegetarian? There's all of these debates that are going about. And in addition to sort of how much of what you should eat, there is the question of what is the actual carbon footprint of the food production that's taking place. Now, I'm a self-confessed chocoholic. I love my chocolate. I really can't exist without it. I'm not vegetarian, but I don't eat a lot of red meat. Imagine my surprise, actually shock horror, when the study came out and I realized that if I wasn't careful about where my chocolate was coming from, I could have a far more detrimental impact on the environment than somebody who was consuming red meat that was produced with low impact. So it's all about sustainable production then, right? So if we manage to focus on foods that are sustainably produced with a low impact on environment, problem solved. Well, infographics like this would kind of back up that argument. So if you looked at the sort of food pyramid that suggests how much of what we should eat, and the environmental pyramid that gives you the associated environmental impact of that, you can see that if we consume a lot of the foods that have the lowest impact on the environment, and we reduce the intake of those foods that have the highest negative impact on the environment, we're doing a good job. But sustainable production is only one side of the coin. Access to healthy diets is the other. Now, this is a UN infographic that talks about how the current burden of malnutrition is unacceptably high all over the world. Now, it's an interesting word, I think. When we talk about malnutrition, I think most people's kind of sort of the image in their minds goes to countries far from here. Maybe countries suffering from drought or famine, maybe those countries which are sort of economically disadvantaged. But would it surprise you to know that currently there are about 3 million people at risk from malnutrition in the UK? over 1 million of those are over the age of 65, but also 1 in 4 children are in food insecure households, with 10% of those in very high risk households in terms of food insecurity. So sustainable production, while really, really important, only works if we are managing to ensure that it can reach everybody, that everyone has access to healthy diets. So this is where I find myself. I'm a conservation biologist. I think biodiversity conservation is important, but can we conserve this biodiversity whilst producing sustainable food that feeds 8 billion plus people on the planet in an accessible, healthy manner? Is it always, how do we do this? Do we do this from a sort of anthropocentric viewpoint, look at it from what we need as humans? Do we look at it from an ecocentric viewpoint and say, we're part of the natural world around us? So is it always going to be an ego versus eco question? Or is it possible at all to find these sweet spots where there is an intersection, where we can manage our landscapes for both people and nature? So I've talked a lot about biodiversity. So let's make it a little bit interactive. So as Dominic mentioned, I work a lot with the Reading Bee team. I work in pollinator ecology. So most people know about the honeybees. Probably everybody's seen bumblebees in your garden. And there are also solitary bees, for instance, that don't live in colonies or in a social structure, but tend to hang out as individuals with an aggregation of their friends, so to speak. Just as a guess, or maybe you've read some of the posters outside, does anybody want to kind of hazard a guess on how many species of bees there are in the UK? Roughly? 250, 300, spot on, around 250 bees. What do we think on a global scale? If there's about 250 bees in the UK, globally, bee diversity, any guesses? 10,000? Up, down? Any other guesses? Pardon? 20,000, okay. That would be good. But I have a very well-informed audience here. So there are about roughly 250 species of bees in the UK and over 20,000 species worldwide. But that's just bees, right? There's over 1 million species, different species of insects. There's over 11,000 species of birds, over 11,000 species of reptiles, over 6,000 mammals. And I'm not even talking about the plants here. So botanists, forgive me for that. But this is the variety of life that is on our planet. And this is what is at risk. So how do we kind of balance the needs of biodiversity conservation with sustainable food production and accessible diets? So what are the key reasons why I work on pollinators, other than my love of coffee and chocolate, is that not just 3/4 of the world's leading crops depend on some sort of animal-mediated pollination, but 90% of the world's flowering plants rely at least in part on animal pollination. So we're talking about biodiversity not just being there with an intrinsic value of nature, but everything that we use in our everyday life is dependent on this biodiversity around us. So how can we protect biodiversity in a sustainable way? One of the ways we can do that is to try and improve our habitat, improve our land management. Now, you will find that quite a lot of my examples are to do with pollinators because that's what I work on. So in the UK, across Europe and in North America, there are agri-environmental schemes and incentives for farmers to make their arable land more wildlife friendly. So wildflower strips, for instance, you might have seen land being taken out of production on the edges of fields where wildflowers are grown. Now, there is good evidence from across the world, but also from our team here in Reading, to show that such sort of floral resources, enhancing floral resources, but also just having semi-natural habitat on the edges of arable fields really help. So what do? Initially, they boost the flower resources in the area. This in turn means that a lot of insects, bees, butterflies, but also beetles, many other sort of beneficial biodiversity is seen. And these sort of beneficial biodiversity then in turn help the farmers in their arable land by enhancing the pollination and enhancing the yield of the crops that are being produced. But it's not just about pollination services. Having those floral rich margins also helps other biodiversity. So you have farmland birds being sort of the farmland birds there might be insectivorous birds that feed on these insects, but also granivorous birds that might benefit from the seeds left over from these floral margins. So putting in those sort of interventions, making the area more wildlife friendly is a surefire way to benefit biodiversity, but also ecosystem services and help production and yield. However, creating wildlife-friendly habitat comes at a cost. Now, as I mentioned, across Europe, in the UK, across North America, there are agri-environmental schemes, there are financial incentives, there are subsidies to enable farmers to take land out of production and put in wildlife-friendly farming measures like wildflower strips. But regardless of whether there are interventions or not, it comes with a financial cost. So for instance, there is an initial investment that the farmer needs to put in, whether that's labor or seeds or taking some land out of production, there is an initial cost. And then it takes a few years for the farmers to break even before they start seeing the returns on their investment. And this happens regardless of whether there's a financial incentive. So can you imagine that if this is the circumstance that farmers find themselves, where they have a financial incentive, and yet it takes a few years for them to break even and then see the returns on their investment? Can you imagine the plight of farmers where such incentives do not exist? So I'd like you to put yourself in the shoes of a farmer and consider for a moment whether you might be willing to accept short-term economic losses for a few years for long-term ecological gain. Now, this is where it gets interactive. So pull out your smartphones, if you will, please. We're having a moment where the Menti hasn't come up. Let me just see what I can do. Sorry about that. Hopefully. Right.
Give me a second to just do what it's doing.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, perfect.
Let's go here. I think this is Mentimeter. Embedded.
It is embedded. It should show up.
I think it's a fault of Mentimeter. We can do it on the smaller screen.
Okay.
Just so that people have got it. So see if they can.
Apologies, folks, but for some reason the presentation view isn't working with Mentimeter. But if you can pull out your smartphones and either scan the QR code or go to menti.com and use the numerical value and vote, putting yourself in the shoes of the farmer. So there's no right or wrong answers here. It's just asking you to consider whether you'd be willing to accept those short-term economic losses. And when I say short-term, I'm still talking a few years versus long-term ecological gain. we'll just leave it. We're having a lot of responses coming in. It's interesting. Sort of stabilized. Right. This is an interesting response and not one I usually get, because quite often I am talking to farmers, and with the best will in the world, those financial losses hit them hard, regardless of where they are in the world. So I'm guessing I'm talking to an audience here that is a lot more biodiversity friendly and not really doing day-to-day farming and not feeling the pressures of that. But it is interesting. Thank you. So basically, this is the kind of situation I found myself in with some smallholder farmers in southern India. And I was talking to them about enhancing floral resources in their fields, putting in wildflower strips, maybe, to enhance pollinators. And they looked at me like I was completely insane. Because when you're talking about areas that are economically disadvantaged, where there are labor shortages, where there might be water problems, wildflower strips sound completely insane, and they were right. But we did chat with them, and the farmers themselves came up with a solution. They said to me, what you want are floral resources for your bees. Can our other crops not provide those floral resources for your bees? And that's how Project Tropical was born. So we had farmers who have mango orchards, and we had farmers who grow moringa in their fields. So moringa, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is an iron-rich tree vegetable crop. And it's a staple of South Indian diets, but it's also an emerging superfood because it's very high in iron. So powdered moringa is being exported from India and Africa to all over the world. Now, in these moringa fields, so this is a moringa field that you see here, the farmers planted marigold in between. And then these, we didn't pick them up when they were flowering, but these are actually red lentils that you see here on the borders of the fields. So we have these marigolds and red lentils as the floral interventions chosen by the farmers, because that would work in their context. And what did we find? So we had control fields without these interventions and fields with these interventions. And what we found was there was a similar pollinator community in both types of fields, but there were a lot more numbers of pollinators. So the abundance, as we say, the abundance of pollinators was significantly higher in the fields with these interventions. And not only was the abundance of pollinators higher, it led to lower pollination deficits. Now, pollination deficit is a term that we use to talk about the difference between the actual pollination that you see, the level of pollination, and the maximum realized potential of pollination. So the gap between the potential pollination maximum and what you actually see in the field. And so that gap was reduced in the fields with the interventions. The farmers experienced increased yield, but it wasn't just the yield, it was better quality produce. So the moringa, the length of the pods was longer, the girth was bigger, it was more seed set. But more important than all these benefits to the main focal crop were the secondary benefits that they got from their co-crops. So marigold, it has cultural value in India. It's used in a lot of rituals, but people also wear them in their hair. And so the farmers were able to sell the marigold for an extra additional source of income. And red lentils, while they didn't sell them, they had them in their own home for their household nutritional needs. It's a high source of protein. So between that sort of economic and nutritional benefit, putting in these floral interventions chosen by the farmers themselves had benefits for biodiversity, but also for production. However, while this is a great story, and these farmers who are involved in our project have gone on to tell their friends and families and neighbors, and there's a whole lot of farmers implementing this. They're trying all sorts of combinations of crops. The one thing that we need to keep in mind is any sort of ecological interventions need to be context specific. So for instance, moringa is a very drought resistant crop. Marigold isn't. So the marigold worked really well during the season where there was ample water supply. But in the height of summer, it probably wasn't the best intervention to use. So to taking into consideration the actual context is really important. So I've talked a lot about sort of how we can improve habitat for pollinators and how things work in the global north, but also in an overseas development context. But that's not the main problem, right? So while farmers accept that having beneficial insects and boosting pollination is great, their main concern is pests. And so there we come to the question of, is there a way we can reduce agrochemical input? Now, again, this is something that's been debated hotly for decades, really. And you may know that, you know, over the years, a lot of chemicals that actually affect pollinators, like the neonicotinoids, have been banned across several countries. But quite often, while certain very dangerous agrochemicals are banned, there are other broad spectrum chemicals in use that are still being utilized. And why are they being utilized? So the UN Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that about 40% of global crop yields are reduced each year due to damage by pests. Now, again, this isn't sustainable for farmers. They have to find ways of controlling pests. Now, how do we do that? Nature actually does have its own solutions. So there are natural enemies of crop pests, beetles, ladybirds, spiders. All of these, when encouraged into arable fields, can help control pests. And they can be a good alternative to using insecticides. Now, a study from our department has shown these were done in apple orchards in Kent. And one of our students has shown that, again, where you have orchards without flower margins and orchards with flower margins, the orchards with flower margins had a high natural enemy population, which helped reduce pests and kind of gave a better yield. A subsequent study by the same team has also shown that just overall, the economics of this, if you have a well-developed natural enemy community, so I'm talking beetles and spiders that suppress pests, even a 10% reduction in this natural enemy population can lead to yield losses. And this has been shown in economically important crops like barley, oilseed rape, and wheat, where there were significant losses anytime the natural enemy community was reduced. Now, here again, kind of extolling flower margins, wildflower strips, same problem going back in an overseas development context where wildflowers are not really going to work. But we did something similar to try and boost natural enemy populations. Same thing that we did in Project Tropical is talk about other crops that could be put in place. So Superfarm India was a project where we worked in 2 regions in India, in the north in Uttarakhand and in the south in Puducherry. And here we focused on rice paddy fields. So this is, you know, the largest sort of rice growing regions in India. And we had rice paddy fields where they had high agrochemical input and fields with low agrochemical input. And in both of these types of fields, we had fields with these additional crops that gave floral interventions and fields without these floral interventions. So just in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the results from the south. So what did we find? We found that in low input fields, there was increased natural enemy populations. This isn't a surprise. So low input fields don't spray. So if you're spraying chemicals, not only are they going to get the pests, they're going to get the beneficials too. So low input fields, there were higher natural enemy populations. What did that then reflect on? So here you find, so let me try and talk you through this. So purple, high input fields, green, low input fields. Dotted lines are the fields with the interventions. So it's not surprising that where there was high agrochemical input, regardless of whether or not there were floral interventions, the pest pressure was really low. But what was really surprising and really heartening to see was in those fields which weren't sprayed with agrochemicals, where there were floral interventions, the pest abundance was comparable to those fields where they were sprayed. So where there were no floral interventions, there was high pest abundance, and that was kind of expected. There was nothing to control the pests. But where there were floral interventions, there were clearly enough natural enemies around to help control the pest populations. And this then translated to yield as well. So normally you would find that there's higher rice yield in fields with high agrochemical input, and that's what we see. But in those fields with low to no agrochemical input with floral interventions, that was comparable to the field with high agrochemical input. So there are ways of managing our land that make it more sustainable for beneficial biodiversity, that without negatively impacting the farmer and their livelihoods. But does biodiversity really matter? And when I say biodiversity, I'm talking about the huge variety of life around us. I've talked about beneficial biodiversity, you know, the things that kind of help with pollination or pest regulation. But do we need all of these species that are out there? Now, a study from 2015, and this was a global study, so they used over 45 different crops from all over the world, and they worked out what species pollinate these crops. And what they found was 80% of crop pollination needs were met by just 2% of species. So if we're focusing just on that basis, that here's the biodiversity that helps us, then that's not a sufficient argument to try and protect the wider biodiversity. We could let the other 98% go, right? Just focus on the 2%. Not quite. Diversity has its own use. So this is a study I followed on from that previous study. So we used 42 different crop data sets from across the world. So we had data from Asia, from Africa, Europe, North and South America. And what we found was from one year to the next, systems that were more diverse, systems that had a more variety of pollinators were more stable. They didn't undergo fluctuations from one year to the next. And that meant that the yield stability was also maintained. There's not this sort of boom-bust aspect happening in terms of yield. So diversity can actually buffer against fluctuations from one year to the next. But is it just about production? You know, is that the sole reason for us to have stable production? That's the only reason we look at diversity? No. Because diversity can also provide resilience for the future. Now, I'm going to use a sporting analogy here, and I'm hoping there's some sort of footy fans here. I'm much more of a cricket person myself, but this works for any sort of team sport. For a team playing at whatever level, the coach or the manager is always going to want to put their best playing 11 on the field, your best strikers, your best defenders. And that's kind of the winning strategy, right? Put your best players on the field. But every team is also only as good as its bench strength, because if your star player on the day gets injured, cannot play for whatever reason, has to be stretched out, whatever, if the substitute isn't half as good, then you've lost already. So it does, and biodiversity works in a similar manner. So you have these sort of star species that are providing us with, stability, with resilience, with ecosystem services. However, if these species tomorrow, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, because of changing environment, because of habitat loss, for whatever reason, can't perform those services or that provide that resilience, have we invested enough in the diversity around us to make sure that other species can pick up the slack? So diversity does provide resilience for the future. But again, I think I'm using a lot of arguments that kind of talk about where biodiversity can benefit us as humans. Biodiversity also has intrinsic value. We, as long as human civilizations have existed, we have been a part of this natural world. So just a couple of examples from the ancient world. The ancient Mayans, for instance, worshipped a bee god. And the reason, and this Armuzen carb shows up in a lot of paintings and tapestries and in a lot of artwork. And it reflects Latin America today, where stingless bees are very much part of people's livelihoods and culture. So that is a sort of example of an integral part where through the centuries, through civilizations, people have not just worshipped, but kind of given a huge value to biodiversity. In India, there was an ancient Sanskrit code of law known as the Manu Samhita. And it basically said that the protection of animals was one of the duties of the king. And this was at a time when hunting was part of the cultural landscape. So while hunting was allowed, it was the duty of the king to ensure that wildlife was still protected. So I think we have never been apart from biodiversity in the world around us. We have always been an integral part. And it's not just sort of ancient stuff. Modern day, right? Almost every country we know of has sort of animals, plants, birds as national emblems. Just the word Singapore, Singapura, means lion city, and the country crest has a lion and the Malayan tiger. The Manchester worker bee, closer to home. The Mancunians are very, very proud of having the worker bee as a symbol. It's the sort of hard work and industrialization and collaborative effort that has and I think it's been a symbol for more than 150 years for Manchester. But also, I found this was a 2016 issued pound coin, and all the plants here are the 4 nations. So you've got the English rose, you've got the shamrock for for Northern Ireland, you've got the thistle. I wasn't really sure why the Welsh got the leeks and not daffodils, but that wasn't a decision I made. So, but also in terms of music, right? So Waltz of the Flowers, Flight of the Bumblebee. If you're listeners to Classic FM, there hasn't been a year in recent history where the Lark Ascending hasn't made the top 5. So biodiversity, the natural world, species, plants, animals, birds, insects, they're very much a part of who we are. Even if we're not making a conscious decision about this, it's woven into the fabric of our lives. But every once in a while, sometimes there comes a moment where there is a stark human-wildlife conflict, where you might have to pause and ask the question, what if it's an actual human life versus a wildlife issue? Let me tell you the story of the Jerdon's causa. Now, this is a nocturnal cousin of the partridge, and it was first described in 1848. For some of you might be familiar with Thomas Jerdon. He was a very renowned British surgeon working out in India, but he's more well known for the fact that he was a natural historian. There's a Jerdon's nightjar, and there's a few different species named after him. So he discovered this bird. Although once he discovered it in the 1840s, it was thought to be extinct for another 86 years before it was rediscovered in the 1980s. Now, there's a very small and declining population of this bird, and the entire global population is found in one state in the southern India, in Andhra Pradesh. And now this bird is listed as critically endangered. So when I was a master's student, I worked on this bird, and I worked on the habitat loss and fragmentation of the species. So the species inhabits scrub jungle, so you see low shrubs with lots of sort of space in between. And as part of my master's research, what I looked at was the habitat loss and fragmentation. And what you see is the sort of brown and pink areas of scrub within a 10-year period were replaced by arable agriculture. So most of that was because land was being cleared, so there was slash and burn agriculture, rice paddy fields coming into play, but also the habitat wasn't just being destroyed, it was being fragmented because water needed to get to the rice paddy fields, and they were building irrigation canals like this that cut through the scrub. So there I was, naive conservation biologist, wanting to save the world, kind of thinking, if this is the only place in the entire world that this bird is found, then surely we have to save the bird, right? We have to put all our efforts into saving the species that is unique. However, while I was out there, these were headlines in national and international newspapers. Now, this is a drought-prone, water-stressed, poverty-stricken area. And farmers were genuinely, when their crops failed due to lack of water to their fields, were committing mass suicide with their families. Now, I know this is a very stark, extreme example of a human-wildlife conflict, but there were decision makers in the area, agricultural officials, forestry officials, environmental officials, who had to make that choice about whether they would save the bird or prioritize human lives. So let's see if Menti works again. But at this point, forget being a farmer, try and put yourself into the shoes of a decision maker and have a think about whether you would prioritize this bird that wasn't found anywhere else in the world and its habitat, or prioritize human lives. Let's see. Okay. Sorry.
I think it's the ad. It will take me a while to fix that.
That's okay. We can go with that. Yeah. So, sorry. So again, if you can scan the QR code or else go to menti.com and use the numerical code and vote, please. I'm impressed. There's a quarter of the audience who are hardcore save the species. It's not surprising, these results, really. I think when push comes to shove, we tend to prioritize ourselves and our human lives, regardless of how endangered a species is. As I said, again, no right or wrong answers here. It's just a choice that decision makers in the region had to face. So what I'd like to tell you was there was a solution to be found. So the researcher who was working on this bird was an extremely passionate individual who would talk to everyone and anyone about this bird. And he incessantly lobbied the agricultural officials, the forestry officials, the environmental officials, anybody who would listen, and quite a lot of people who didn't want to listen as well. But in the end, it took about 10 years, but there was a committee appointed by the Supreme Court that basically the end result of that was these irrigation canals were still there, getting water to the fields, but they were rerouted. And the scrub jungle was designated as a wildlife sanctuary for this bird. So it took a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of persistence. But with that time, effort, and persistence, a win-win could be found for both wildlife and humans. And the reason I'm trying to kind of come up with these win-win solutions is not just to say it is possible, but for us to sort of stop and think about how the choices we make on a day-to-day basis impact the world around us. So what motivates our decision-making? What do we value the most? So it could be food security. It could be the fact that we want to ensure that our family, our kids have access to healthy diets, sustainably produced. It could be financial security. You might be at the producer end of things where, you know, a crop loss one year can wipe you out financially. So financial security might be what drives your decision making. It could be ecosystem resilience. You could be thinking sort of long-term future. Do we need to invest in biodiversity to make sure that, you know, generations hence there is a planet left for our children and our grandchildren and the subsequent generation? Or you could just value nature for its intrinsic value and say, you know what, I don't need to benefit from nature. It has its value and a right to exist. It could be a combination of all of these things, or it could be something completely different. So for my last mentee, I'm going to try, let's see, same problem. We'll. Thanks, Frankie.
That's what technicians do.
Technical issues, but at this point, it's a free, you get free rein, right? So try and think about what might motivate your choices and decisions when it comes to protecting nature. And I think it allows you to have an infinite number of inputs, but, you know, don't feel free to kind of put in your top choice. Aww. So this is an interesting one. I've never done this one before, so I have no idea what to expect. It's interesting to see sort of beauty and love and joy there, in addition to sort of food security and coexistence, intrinsic value, happiness, balance, existential future. I find this really interesting because I think a lot of the things that you're talking about there are not tangibly measurable. Beauty, balance, joy. So there's something clearly deep within us that says we need to protect biodiversity and nature, not because it gives us these services that make things better or it gives us ecosystem resilience, but purely because we find joy and beauty in seeing the world around us. And the reason I asked you to think about your choices and your decisions is because I think the reason why we do things makes a big difference in how we choose to live our lives, right? What motivates us? What drives us forward? So I'm just going to finish with another quote. And this is from one of my favorite poets, a Lebanese poet called Khalil Gibran, who talks about our reason and our passion being the rudder and sails of our seafaring souls. If either our sails or rudder be broken, we can but toss and drift, or else be held at standstill. So have a think about what you're passionate about. Have a think about why. What is your reason for wanting to protect biodiversity and nature? And I hope with that, we would be able to make those choices that ensure a sustainable future, protecting biodiversity, and moving forward and making progress. Thank you very much. So just a quick word of thanks. All of this is a collaborative effort, so there's a lot of people and I can't thank them all individually. So this is a team that I'm very much indebted to for all the work that I presented today. The Reading B team, particularly Ellen, Vinny, Rosie and Layla for helping today. The events team, everybody who's been involved, and a host of other collaborators across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepa, for a great lecture. You left us with some really big questions, and I'm sure there are a couple of really big questions in the audience. We have 2 roving mics, which will come around to you, and we also have someone monitoring online for any questions for those who are on the video stream. So who wants to make a start? Yes, over there.
Thank you for your lecture. It was really informative. I suppose my question is that science has a lot of answers for some of the, disturbing things that are happening to our climate and our world. I was thinking about what you think about the role of corporations whose aim is to maximize their profits. So they don't care if these natural solutions and your very ingenious solutions and the farmer solutions are there, because that doesn't make them money. So for me, a huge part of the equation must be tackling the power of these corporations.
I couldn't agree more. But I don't think the balance of power is only with the corporations. I think we are consumers of the corporations. And I think we do have a role to play in influencing those choices.
We do, but I mean, I think the question of our choices as consumers, I don't think we have. I think the balance of power is very much in favour of the corporations because they drive it. We don't all want everything as much plastic in our lives as we've got, but how much choice do we have about that?
I think you're right. I agree with you, but I do think that it's a problem when we're trying to do a one size fits all. I think certain things can work in certain contexts. Certain choices can work in certain contexts. So, I mean, my work with the farmers, yes, I'm not influencing the corporations, but at the production level, we did still manage to find a solution that works for the farmer and biodiversity. And there are corporations in the agri-food business that I know that incentivize those environmental practices because that's what their consumers want. And so that's why I say there is a role for us to play in kind of lobbying the corporations in sort of the products that we use every day. It will take time. It's not an overnight solution, but I think corporations can only be swayed, not only swayed by consumers, but also the policies that are in place. So I think there is a little bit of the lobbying from the consumer to the corporations, but also in terms of the policies that are in place that will then shift corporations towards more environmental sustainability.
Thank you. I hope so.
You have another question. I'll say online.
I have a question from Sarah on the live stream. So they've asked, are there any policies or initiatives like No Mow May that could be applied or enforced to further help our biodiversity?
I think there's plenty of policies. I think people's gardens, yes, No Mow May is a good one, but also sort of we're trying to talk about reducing agrochemical input in farmland, but we all are sort of probably don't want to see weeds in our garden. So we can think about various ways of controlling that do not require agrochemical input. No Mow May is a really good success, but again, it kind of comes up against people's idea of what a pristine garden should look like. So there is a little bit of sort of social change required. I don't know, when I first came to England as a student, I think smoking was prevalent. You couldn't walk into a pub and come out, even if you were not a smoker, you'd still be smelling of cigarette smoke. And somewhere over time, it became socially unacceptable, right? So similarly, if we move from that social construct of having a pristine grass, no flower lawn to No Mow May, we can affect those changes. It takes time, but we can affect those changes.
Over there.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. So my quick question is, what role do you think, for example, finance or investment can play in protecting the biodiversity to ensure that we have a future? Yeah.
I think it's a really important role. I will put my hand up and say it's not my area of expertise, but I think there is a lot more investment going into things like biodiversity net gain. And kind of making sure that our habitats are more conducive to support larger groups of species, and there are financial incentives and green finance taking place along those lines. So as I said, it's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to speak too much into that. But I think as a society, you have to come at it from all sorts of angles. It's not just the producer, it's not just the consumer, it's not just the corporations, but across the board, kind of if everybody does their part, then as a collective whole, we can make a difference.
We got a question over there.
Hi, thank you. I do agree with you about the consumer power. Back in the 90s, while I was working with environmental journalism, I actually saw a lot of initiatives actually working. There was like a big campaign about plastics where activists, they would go to the supermarkets and drop all the plastics, all the containers of the packaging of the food as a form of protest. And now what we see today is they charge for the bags, for instance. So there are papers where we saw now paper production is actually kind of less environmental damaging than in the 90s. And the problem now, it is digital, which was expected to actually resolve environmental problems, is actually offsetting those gains. How do you see a way that we could actually motivate a greater democratic participation of citizens in a way that is rational, in a way that is not driven by the immediacy and the reactions of social media, but actually informed and target and mature and collaborative?
Excellent question. And I think you've almost touched upon the answer there. I think we're living in an era of information overload, right? There's information coming at us from all angles, and quite often it's hard to separate the truth or what is right and accurate from all the noise out there. And I think, I mean, as a scientist, I think I do have a responsibility for ensuring that information I put out there is accurate. But also, I'm realizing more and more, it's not just enough to do the research and have the findings. It's making sure that it reaches the people that it needs to reach, whether it's policymakers, practitioners on the ground, everyday person on the street, making sure that they can access that information in a manner that works for them. I mean, it's also like, I think policy, practice, research, they all speak slightly different languages, and not just English, right? It's just the means of communication, and kind of being able to learn to communicate better as scientists, I think is really, really key for us in getting the accurate information across.
Great, I'm going to get a couple of questions, I think, because we're coming sort of to the end. So we have three. We have one online, we have one there in the center, and I think there was one on the right there, yeah.
So this one's from the live stream. Someone has asked, would you agree that small-scale mixed farming is a part of the answer, particularly in this country? And how do we overcome access to land and the cost that's passed on to the consumer?
So we had one, maybe until we get the mic into the middle, we can have the question on the right.
We're taking all, yeah.
Yeah, we take three, I think.
Thank you. My question was about whether there are any studies on how diversity is affected with the installation of the solar farms, some of which take quite a large part of the land. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, and we had one there in the center. Can we get a mic? Yeah. Which mic gets there first? That's it, okay.
So action and communication, that's my key takeaway from this. What's one action that you would suggest for us when we walk out those double doors to implement and to do?
Okay. Right.
Great
I'll
final
try
question.
Great final question. I'll have to think about it. So I think in terms of the question about moving to more small-scale farming, I think it's less about the scale, more about how diverse it is, rather than having vast swathes of single crop monoculture. Mixed, diversified farming systems, I think, would help. And I think, you know, policies are in place, emerging. There's the environmental land management scheme, things that support that. So I think it's, again, you know, sort of preaching to the converted about diversity here, but whether we're talking about biodiversity or farming crop diversity, I think that is one of the answers. Sorry, could you remind me?
Solar farms.
Solar farms.
Solar farms, yes. So I do take your point about solar farms taking over huge areas of land, but there are certain areas where I know solar farms have also had huge amounts of wildflowers grown under them, and people have put out beehives there. So there's pros and cons, definitely. And I think, again, depending on the context and how the solar farms are managed, they can be really good for biodiversity. And the takeaway, I think it's a challenging question, because I think I could sort of try and give you an answer from my perspective that may not work for your context. So I think that is why I finished with the slide I finished, because what drives you and what motivates you to make a change in your life would not be the same as the person sitting next to you, might not be the same as me. I think the one change I would make is think hard before you have the purchasing power as a consumer. You have the power over whatever, you know, whether you have a garden or a window box, you have the power as to how you manage it. So in your sphere of influence, think long and hard about what kind of positive change you can make.
Thank you, and thank you all for fantastic questions, a great lecture and a great
thank you very much
afterwards. So, before I can let you go, before I ask you again to just thank Deepa for our lecture, just a few announcements. It is our centenary, so upcoming next month is our community festival, and this time it's not just one day, but it's a 2-day community festival. One day up here on the 16th of May. And there'll be plenty of research shows. I think Deepa will be there, the bees will be there, lots of things will be there. Huge amount of research to see and colleagues to talk to. So please come to that. Great
hopefully
food.
Slightly more active.
And hopefully the weather will be as good as it was today. And then on the 17th of May, we're moving down into the town centre for a rag parade and further celebrations, culminating in a grand finale in the Forbury Gardens, so under the line. So please join us for the Centenary Community Festival. Have a look at the website. There's plenty more information there. We have the next lecture coming up on the 15th of June, which is our upcoming Climate Festival lecture, which will be in Reading Town Hall, not here. And of course, please have a look at our events page where you can see all other events. So once again, let me thank Deepa, let me thank you for coming tonight, whether you're here or whether you're on the live stream. Thank you for your great questions and a great lecture, and have a good night and a good journey home. Thank you very much.